Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us around the world to this last day of Oxford HR's Knowledge Festival. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be here today. And as we wait for our guests to join us, I would just like you to make use of the comment box at the bottom of the chat. There you'll see a comment box. I would like you to let us know where you are joining us from today. Pop in there, share your name, contact details, because at the end of the day, after this, we would like to connect with you and get to know you better. So make use of the comment box. What are we going to talk about today? It's very exciting, and we have a great panel of two ladies and one gentleman who are joining us. But let me just introduce you to what the Knowledge Festival is. So this is a series of Zoom panel discussions aiming at fostering collaborations and discussion on issues that are trending in the for-purpose sector. As you all know, many of us work in the for-purpose sector, as well as some from social enterprises, non-profits, as you may call it, or charities, depending on where you're joining us from. And a little bit about Oxford HR. Oxford HR is a global executive search and organizational effectiveness firm working exclusively with for-purpose sector. About me, my name is Dr. Caroline Opinde. I am the founder of the NGO Whisperer. We are a consulting business. We provide technical support to nonprofits around the world so they can successfully impact people's lives. We believe in connecting people, raising funds, and impacting lives globally. We have collaborated with Oxford HR now since 2019, and they have contributed to the work that we do. As you can see, our magazines, our podcast, as well as providing technical support in areas that we work in as advisors, and many other projects that we will be sharing with you in the coming year. And so let's get to today's conversation. Today, we are talking about African philanthropy. I know when we talk about philanthropy in Africa, many of you think about so many things. You know, is it African billionaires coming in and millionaires coming in to give money? But in my thinking, when I think about African philanthropy, one word that comes to my mind is Ubuntu. I am because we are. That comes to my mind when I think about African philanthropy. I'd like to pose a question, even before we start, is what does African philanthropy mean to you? What does, when you think about that word, or when I mention it, what does that mean to you? Go to the comment section, write what African philanthropy means to you personally, or when you hear that word, what picture do you have in mind? We will be sharing that shortly. So now we're going to be here today discussing this with a great panel that we have. And I would like to invite them to introduce themselves briefly before we go into this exciting and knowledge festival, you know, sharing knowledge and insights. And I will start with Adwoa Agyeman. Let people know who you are, where you come from, and your interest in African philanthropy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. C, for that wonderful, warm welcome. My name is Adwoa Agyeman. I am Ghanaian American and have worked in the philanthropic sector for close to 20 years on the global level, on the continent for the past 10 years. And I found my way back to the US to continue my journey in philanthropy. What took me to the continent was really the desire to understand more about African philanthropy. I had the pleasure of working at one of the preeminent organizations on this topic at hand, Trust Africa, one of the pioneering organizations which really set forth the practice of African philanthropy on the continent, and also the research of African philanthropy on the continent. And I have I'll just end with just saying that when I think of African philanthropy, I think that anyone connected to the African experience, from the time you enter this cosmology, this universe, you are connected to African philanthropy. And then when you transcend and when you move on to the next life, you depart also with goodwill and a connection to African philanthropy. And I'll be using my time to talk more about what that actually means when we're having this discussion about African philanthropy. I've shared my bio, so I'll just leave it at that. I'm really excited to be with my esteemed panelists today, and I'm excited about this phenomenal conversation we're going to have. Thank you very much.
We are honored to have you, Adwoa. Next, we have Chantal Uwizera. Let us know where you come from and what does African philanthropy mean to you?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Caroline. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Chantal Uwizera, and I'm head of Africa Philanthropy for Save the Children. And I've been in this role since the beginning of this year. And prior to that, I've had over 10 years of experience just working on Africa. That's just my passion. I worked on higher education reform before, so looking at what are the skills and training that young people need to enter the job market. I also worked for Rwanda, where I'm from, specifically advancing Africa's position and policies on economic and social issues discussed at the UN. And the way that I approach Africa philanthropy and the way that I think about it, it goes back to my parents. And I think all of us, we can attest to the fact that, it's in our DNA, it's who we are. I grew up in Rwanda. I grew up seeing my parents paying school fees and supporting communities. And so it was no brainer that I'll end up here. And I think that for me, in my work and what I would love to sort of like talk about during this conversation is that all of us sort of like have a role to play. And I think that it's high time for African philanthropy to receive the recognition that it needs and the recognition that it so deserves. A lot of African philanthropists, whether they're high net worth individuals or just regular individuals, have been doing incredible work to effect social change on the continent. And so just really would love, I'm so excited to be on this conversation, to hear from the audience and as well as my esteemed panelists on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Really beautiful introduction, and tying it back to philanthropy starting at home with your family. For most of us, that's how we saw philanthropy in our African setting. Next, we have the only man and the gentleman in this panel, Mwila Bwanga. Mwila, share with us where you come from and what does African philanthropy mean to you?
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you very much. First and foremost, I am really excited to be part of this amazing discussion. I hope I'm audible enough, Caroline.
Yes, you are. We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you to Oxford HR for having me. And I'm delighted, to be on a panel with such amazing brains, that are working hard in trying to reshape and reclaim the identity of African philanthropy. My name is Bwanga. I am Zambian, working with Africa Philanthropy Network, a philanthropic-driven organization, that seeks to, base our focus on, reshaping, reclaiming, and rewriting the whole entire narrative of African philanthropy. I personally am working as a communications and membership engagement director for the organization. I always view African philanthropy as something that has always existed, even way beyond human civilization in the African context. It's not something that is new to us as Africans. It's not something that is alien. It's something that is part of our DNA. It's something that we do without thinking. It's something that we do without practice. It's something that we do without trying to prepare for it. But it's a part of who we are, and it's a part of what we have come to be as Africans. You know, defined in one particular context, I'll just call that as Ubuntu, as Caroline earlier said when we started our conversation. So, you know, even as we deliberate on, you know, during this, amazing virtual meeting, I think something that has to be paramount, something that has to be secondary, something that has to be important as we engage is the need to understand that African philanthropy in itself goes way beyond human civilization in the African context. So thank you so much for having me. Philanthropy is a part of my DNA. You know, it's what I do as, you know, it's part of me like breathing. So I hope to share what I can share with the rest of the attendees that we have today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, our esteemed panel. You know, Adwoa, Chantal, and Mwila, who will be talking through or taking us through what African philanthropy and opportunities and challenges that exist within it. And we've just started it on a very high note to see that African philanthropy, and I love what you've all said, and it all boils down to African philanthropy already existed before there was even that word philanthropy within our communities. In some communities, you know, coming from Kenya, we called it Harambee. When you hear Harambee, it means people are coming together, putting their resources. And the beauty of it is it wasn't limited to monetary resources. It was also in kind in so many ways and continues to be so. So as we go into today's topic to listen to our esteemed panel, I would like you to begin taking notes and go make use of the comment box. If you have any questions, go to the Q&A section and let this be a highly interactive conversation where you're asking us questions. And the format that we will take is we will have our esteemed panel come in, speak, and then you can take notes and share with us, you know, your thoughts in the chat section. If you have any questions, please pop it in the Q&A section where we will have the opportunity to respond to it here through discussions or even directly to you. So now as we go through this, I would like to have our first panelist, Adwoa Agyeman, come on and talk to us and share the context of African philanthropy and share this with us based on your experience, because today we're talking practical things from the African perspective, the opportunities, the challenges, and lessons that you have learned. So for the next 15 minutes, we'll have Adwoa come on and share this with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caroline. So as I mentioned, my name is Adwoa Agyeman, and I think for me, I really came to the African continent initially to really fulfill something within me. As I mentioned, I'm Ghanaian American, but I actually grew up all the way on the other side of the world and grew up in Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific in the 80s and 90s. So for me, finding my way to the continent was really a part of fulfilling something within me. And when I started my career in the Washington, D.C. area, I really had an opportunity to learn about an initiative called the Special Initiative on Africa. And that initiative was incubated in the Ford Foundation and really struck me as something which was unique and special because it was Africans coming together, Africans within the philanthropic sector who works for some of the biggest foundations that we know of, who wanted to start an initiative which would be rooted on the continent, for us, by us, and for us to set the agenda. So with that in mind, I really followed the organization, found my way finally to Trust Africa, and really started to get my education. I happened to be there at at a time when one of the preeminent scholars on African philanthropy, Dr. Becky Moyo, was there. And the question I asked at the beginning, or the statement I posed about us as Africans, or us with any connection to the continent, really having some sort of connection to African philanthropy from the time we come into this world to the time that we leave, was something that he really laid out in a paper 10 years ago, where he talked about this notion that we've mentioned on this conversation about this really being a part of our African philosophy, African philanthropy, it being about the things that we've talked about, Ubuntu, it being about solidarity, mutual aid, reciprocity, and relationship building. One of the things that I really appreciate about that seminal work, which has really formed my understanding on the topic, is that oftentimes when we talk about philanthropy within our context, it's oftentimes downgraded to being informal, or being sort of less than when we think about other forms of philanthropy. And he cautions against that. And he talks about us thinking about this being a vertical and a horizontal approach. When we think about virtual forms of philanthropy, we talk about some of the things that my esteemed panelists have talked about. We talk about and think about Harambes. We think about tontines in West Africa and Francophone Africa. We think about Stokvels in Southern Africa. We think about Isusu in West Africa. And we think about sometimes our even religious practices. I think that sometimes when these conversations, there's the supremacy of the Anglophone speaking parts of the continent. And sometimes the Francophone, the Lusophone, and even our actual African languages are not given the space that they need. But I just wanted to highlight, just because I've spent some significant time now in Senegal, just the forms of giving within Islam and how that is also very interlinked to this conversation that we're having. When we think about this, Dr. Caroline mentioned this, that we often think also that this is a conversation about African high net worth individuals. And contrary to that, when we think now about the vertical, we've sort of talked about these practices of philanthropy which are vertical, and then we would say that the African high net worth individuals would fit on the vertical axis, where we find those traditional forms of philanthropy, such as individual giving, that we give from church to charities, that we also participate in with the formal organizations we know on the continent, like the African philanthropy networks that we've talked about, and Trust Africa, KCDF, Kenya Community Development Foundations, and the likes of them. When we have this conversation about African philanthropy, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that we also have to bring to bear to the conversation. For me, when I think about African philanthropy, I think about the actual history of philanthropy on this continent. Oftentimes, we think about this as a foreign direct investments that have come and the aid flows that have come, but this is also about a relationship that we've had also with philanthropists, private philanthropists for decades now. So some controversial, some not so controversial, but big institutions who have had these ongoing relationships with us. I think about the liberation struggle, how many African countries showed solidarities and stood in solidarity with different countries on the continent by opening their doors, by sharing their resources so freely. That is part of our African narrative and our African story. And I think that when we are the authors of that narrative, it is really quite powerful. When we think about African philanthropy, we think about those who have gone before us. We think about our parents' generation, the generations that came after the colonial experience and before, who benefited from philanthropy. Thinking of institutions like the African American Institute in the US that really shaped and funded some of our preeminent African scholars and change makers, like Wangari Maathai, who came through that fellowship program, Barack Obama Sr., who came through that fellowship program. When we think about African philanthropy, we cannot take off the table also our African governments. Oftentimes when we have these conversations, because of the controversial role that civil society, government, and the African philanthropic space and business play in this constellation, we don't often think about the role sometimes that government is playing to the positive benefit for philanthropy. African philanthropy needs an enabling environment. And there are some countries on the continent, such as Rwanda, yay, such as Ghana, yay, such as South Africa, such as Kenya, such as even a place like Liberia, where I've witnessed when former Prime Minister, President Johnson Sirleaf was in charge, and her setting up a philanthropic secretariat within government. We had a lot of dealings when I was at Trust Africa with Liberia, and this secretariat within government was to be able to see the aid flows coming into the country and to be able to document that so that philanthropy was in partnership with government. When we think about philanthropy, I know Chantal is going to talk more about this, but we need to have that conversation also about the African diaspora and the remittance that have been and continue to be a safety net, part of the development ecosystem on the continent. I want to go back to this discussion that I started with, that I referred to. When we think about philanthropy, we oftentimes think about this just being about formalized billionaires making their mark. But I want to talk a little bit about that. Oftentimes, new philanthropists on the continent with resources really start off in a very, what I would term, a brick and mortar sort of way in how they think about their giving. And oftentimes they are working within the philanthropic framework, even though they are very much needed in very much the way in which Western or philanthropists from outside of the continent have established themselves. And I think that one of the things that we have to recognize, data is so limited on the continent. And I just want to point to a statistic that the Lilly School, which is one of the preeminent schools on philanthropy in the US, each year comes out with data on philanthropic resources that are generated from the formal, traditional philanthropic high net worth individuals as opposed to individual giving. And year and year and year, we see that the statistics show last year it was over $3 billion given by individuals to support philanthropy. Over 300 billion, let me say that again. And then compared to high net worth individuals, which was around $88 billion. And when you see that difference, I think that it is safe to say, with all the ways in which I've talked about giving happening and African philanthropy happening on the continent, I think we would be right to say that African high net worth individuals are not the ones who are providing the most sort of philanthropy. It is individuals, it is all of us who are contributing to this philanthropic conversation. I wanted to just end my comments with talking a little bit about trust. I've talked about this amazing ecosystem that exists on the continent and the strides that are being made. But on the continent, we cannot have this honest conversation that we're engaging in philanthropy, about philanthropy on the continent today, without talking about how fractured all these different entities are in their participation in philanthropy on the continent. These vertical associations and groups and formations and giving and this traditional access are not in sync in the way that they need to be able to push philanthropy forward. And we need to be able to do more. There's so many opportunities that we have seen over the years. We've seen that some of these traditional vertical mechanisms I've talked about, technology has come to be able to be leveraged, to be able to provide new ways in which our emerging economies can engage within philanthropy. I wanted to end and talk about an initiative that I've been involved in for the past 6 years. After being at Trust Africa for 5 years, I left to co-found an organization with a former colleague of mine at Trust Africa called Epic Africa. And we saw that there was a problem within the African philanthropic sector. Oftentimes you hear funders, high net worth individuals, funders from outside of the continent, even individual funders on the continent say that they can't find good non-for-profits to invest in on the continent. And we saw that there was a huge gap in data. We started and embarked on a journey to be able to fill those capacity gaps and really realize that for the continent to continue to thrive, we really need to solve this problem of all these different groups who are part of the ecosystem. We need them to be able to work together to be able to more formally push the agenda of African philanthropy forward. And I'm happy to talk more about the ways in which Epic Africa has been able to answer that call through leveraging data and to be able to answer the call in providing data around the COVID epidemic. And I think with that, I will end for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a powerful, powerful presentation right there. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. I would like to see some likes, some love, some likes in the chat section, and some thank yous to Adwoa Agyeman from African Communities Together. And the amazing thing, you know, that she has left us with is that they are putting together data. And this is one of the biggest questions that people have been asking. We know there is a lot happening in Africa, but data is missing. Well, we won't be saying that anymore because we have someone we can look up to and ask her, where's data about this? Where can we source it? We would really like to follow on that. And the contact details, I believe, will be in the chat section. You can follow up on the website and the links for the organization that she works with, Adwoa Agyeman EPIC, and you will be able to find data. There's a question there in the chat section that speaks about this. Thank you, Alice Lungubwala, for your question about data in Africa, and I believe Adwoa will be responding to that. Now we will go straight into looking at what Save the Children has been doing as we look into post-COVID-19 pandemic situation. How is pandemic going to look like? And we have great experiences from organizations that are doing amazing things. We're doing amazing things, as we call it now, BC, before COVID, during and post-COVID. You know, these days when you say BC, it's no longer the BC we know, it's, you know, it's 2019. So I would like to invite Chantal to come on and share with us, really go deeper, Chantal. Take us through this journey. How are NGOs, you know, part of solution, and what is Save the Children doing? We want to learn from your experience. We want to learn from some of the highly esteemed international NGOs such as Save the Children that you're working with, and how to foster meaningful collaborations, you know, touching on the diaspora and harnessing on it intelligently. Chantal, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline, for giving me the floor. And I think before I, you know, sort of like start speaking more about, you know, to answer your question, I think I would like to acknowledge what Adwoa said. And I, you know, the way that we Save the Children or other organizations are really interested in African philanthropy, we're able to do the work. We're able to sort of like start understanding the opportunities because of the incredible research that has been done by Trust Africa, by African Philanthropy Network. And I think this points to the need to do more research about African philanthropy from our African voices, because I think that's the only way we can sort of like understand the opportunities and the ways of giving. So what I thought I would do in the next few minutes is first to provide an overview of, you know, what Save the Children is and what we do. And also to your question, I think, offer my reflection on what the pandemic and as well as the Black Lives movement has done to our work and how we start thinking about, you know, where we go from there. And so to begin, for some of you who may not be familiar with Save the Children, we're the world's leading independent organization on children. We have programs across 117 countries, including 39 countries on the continent. And we deliver programs in nutrition, health, education, humanitarian emergency, child protection. And I think what I love about our programs is that they're grounded in community acceptance. So we really work with local communities, we work with partners, we work with government to sort of like design and deliver programs tailored to the unique and unique needs of the under-resourced communities where we are. And just quickly, I think last year, our programs supported around 50 million children and 38 million adults. And in terms of how we started working with African philanthropists and African diaspora, I think for the longest, when you look at our donor profile, it did not represent the countries and the people that we were working with, and we needed to change that. And so in 2019, Save the Children established the Africa Philanthropy Initiative, you know, to start to explore how do we work with African philanthropists. Those include high net worth individuals, the next gen philanthropists, just, you know, regular individuals as well, and also the African diaspora, and to do that in the most authentic way. And I think that, you know, obviously, as Adwoa said, for me, it is exciting to work with African philanthropists and to see the opportunities, where the opportunities are, because their giving and the way that they give is quite different. I think it's personal, right? They give in the communities where they're from. And so for me, they provide the right partners to stay there long term, because unlike maybe other funders, they know the issues, they have closer tie to the communities, and therefore really understand the best way to sort of like address those issues. And on this journey that we are on, we also established an Africa advisory board dedicated to support our work. It is currently right now made of 14 members, incredible 14 experts in different sectors, who some of them have lived experiences on the continent, have are passionate about, about children, are passionate about social impact, but I think more so are really passionate about raising the visibility of what African philanthropists are doing and continue to do to effect social change on the continent. And when we did that, I think maybe I can just give one example of one of the philanthropists that we work with closely. We established a partnership, a multi-year partnership with DJ Kapi and the Kapi Foundation in northern Nigeria to prevent and address malnutrition in northern Nigeria. And really that was, I think it is a true partnership in the sense how we see and how we want to work with philanthropists. They provide us and they help us to understand much better the challenges, and they share their knowledge with us. But I think more so importantly, I think they influence the way that we think, our internal systems and our internal processes. And I think that's where African philanthropists can play a critical role, right? When we have more African philanthropists working with NGOs, they're able to share and able to do, to sort of help our work. Excuse me, 1 second. Sorry, somebody just knocking. I'm sorry. Working on, Zoom. So sorry about that. So that's just give an overview of the way that we work with African philanthropists. And now I think I will maybe offer as well our reflection to your point about, where do we go post-pandemic? And I think the pandemic really shown us the way that African philanthropists are supporting our work. And I think it also showed that, they are the way that I think African philanthropists have started to do, they gave in unprecedented ways. And I think Adwoa mentioned that, right? And I think before the pandemic, most of us were not aware of the work and the great, contribution that African philanthropists are having on the continent. And I think it took the pandemic for many around the world to see the incredible contribution that they're having. And for us, it also shows, and Adwoa mentioned that as well, on the need to develop better mechanism. And I think having better channels to sort of like allow more African philanthropists to enter this space and to be able to support more work and come to this space. So I think that, I would love to hear more about the other panelists and as well as the audience, what are the channels and what other ways we can bring them in. And in terms of like the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think it forced us to address the long overdue inequalities in the international development space. And for Save the Children, we have been doing the work for quite some time. We looked internally our systems. How can we do better? How can we change? We assessed our ways of working, and we also looked at the way we communicate our work, the images that we use, so that they're not reinforcing this sort of like discriminatory and racist perceptions. And there is a glossary, you can find it on our website, that looked at what we do not believe we should be using or what type of words we should be using. But I think for us, it goes beyond that, right? In order for us to be able to do the work that we do in the most effective way and have better outcome and better impact for children, it means shifting power. It means shifting resources. It means shifting capacity and ownership to national and local actors who I think are best placed to do the work. And they have a closer understanding of the ways that children's rights are being violated, and also how they may be fulfilled. And specific to African philanthropists, I think it also provides us a really an opportunity to advance our localization efforts. I think one of the points that also came from Adwoa's point, discussion, is on the need to strengthen the local organizations, who I think for me in the long run are best placed to increase impact for children. And we have heard directly from those that we work with, the local organizations we work with, on the need to change and the need to make our processes and systems more inclusive, on the need for us to help the local actors to access more flexible funding that can cover the true cost of operating in very challenging location. And I think it's also an area that a lot of funders and a lot of African philanthropists are interested in supporting, and that sort of like helps us to understand where the collaboration can be between using our resources and our expertise and using African philanthropists' expertise as well, to sort of like really understand and come up with mechanisms that will allow for the funding to flow just beyond implementation of our child rights issues, but really going into strengthening local organizations. And so it's an area that Save the Children is really quite interested in finding more partners who can work on that. And then I think I will end by saying that one of the things that I'm also looking at and that I think about whenever we talk about the shifting the power and this like the colonization debate, I think that we rightly so, we focus on the international aid architecture and that it needs to change its policies. But I think for me, we do need to do the work and expand the table and bring in this sort of like international development space, more voices. And that means finding ways to partner with African philanthropists, whether it's through multi-stakeholder partnerships, where we have African philanthropists, global partners, local and national actors really coming together. And I think we can all agree, many of the challenges we're facing, there are so many for one organization and one funder to be able to address it. We have climate change now, we have obviously COVID and crisis, humanitarian and conflicts, that I think that if we can find a way, and I think a best way for us to come together and work together to address them, then we're in a better position to leave a better world to our children. So I'll end there and happy to take questions at the end in terms of what else we can do and how to harness that sort of like collaboration together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chantal Uwizera from Save the Children, sharing practical examples of what you've been able to achieve at Save the Children. What I really loved, and I was busy taking notes here while you are speaking, I love the fact that Save the Children has examples of how you are shifting power, decolonizing philanthropy, shifting the capacity and resources to local actors. That is really coming from a large organization, a global organization, reaching 50 million children, serving or impacting the lives of 30 million adults. That's massive. And when you can show that at large scale and how that can trickle down to different countries that you work in, the 39 countries that you work in Africa, those are powerful lessons, really. So ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, go to the chat section, and a big thank you to Chantal for sharing this with us and the examples that she has shared from Save the Children. I believe there is a link where we can read more and access this information. Thank you to the team that we are working with here at Oxford HR. We appreciate that very much. As we take this to the next level, now we have the one and only gentleman in our panel, and I would like to invite Mwila Bwanga from Africa Philanthropy Network. And Mwila will take us through, going deeper into issues, how to tell our story really as Africans, our philanthropic stories, and how to rewrite the narrative for the African philanthropy and the best practices that we have. It's not that we haven't had them, we've had them, but we need to tell our stories and rewrite them in ways that show impact. Again, it's going back to the data and how do we tell this? And then Mwila will also focus his discussion on the need to shift power, as Chantal just mentioned a few minutes ago. Mwila, take it away.
Thank you so very much, Caroline. Thank you very much. First and foremost, I'd love to say, wow, the contributions and the submissions that have come, from my colleagues, they are profound, they are igniting, they are inspiring, they are everything that we need for this amazing discussion. I was attending a virtual meeting with some colleagues from Germany. We had a roundtable discussion where they invited me to speak about how do we reimagine African philanthropy to drive social change. And when I labored to define African philanthropy, one gentleman actually, after I had finished my deliberation, he went on to say, before you spoke, and when I learned that you're talking about African philanthropy, I started asking myself, is there such a thing as African philanthropy, or is literally just philanthropy, so to speak? And that in itself, got me thinking to say, there's a particular narrative, that has been programmed in certain sectors in the philanthropic sector, where many people think Africans don't give. Many people have the perceptions that, due to how, foreign aid and, donor funding has disrupted, so many of our institutions, so many of our governance structures, we live in a community where many people in the global South, they may feel as though, Africans, by nature, we stretch out our hands more to beg as opposed to actually giving. But, when I heard that gentleman say that during that German roundtable discussion on reimagining African philanthropy, I responded and said, Africans give and they give a lot. The only challenge that we have as regards African philanthropy is what is data and the documentation of our own stories. And I feel that's something that I really want to talk about today, because I feel like we are not telling our own stories in a way that we have to tell our own stories. And it's broader than just African philanthropy, but it goes bigger than even how are we telling our African story as regards leadership? How are we telling our African story as regards governance? How are we telling our African story as regards human rights? How are we telling our African story as regards climate change? So when we look at all these other, broader perspective of social change, it's very important that we organize ourselves as the philanthropic community in how we tell our story, in how we rewrite the narrative, so that many people out there can begin looking at African philanthropy as a driver for social change, as a driver for community development, as a driver for community engagement, as a driver for community integration. Because in our quest to globalize African philanthropy, we should never reach a point where we look down on that which is happening at the local level. I think it's very important. In our quest where we want to ensure that African philanthropy is perfectly understood at that global level, we should never reach a point where we begin to look down on our African best practices, because that is what drives our agenda. That is what drives who we are as Africans. So, even when we talk about the aspect of shift the power, there's a famous story that was given of some gentlemen that came, to a particular region, and they wanted to bring about community development in that particular region by planting a little bit of tomato, closer to the nearby river. So they did what they could. These gentlemen were from Italy, so they came to Africa. They planted these amazing tomatoes, and a few months later, these tomatoes, they grew so big. And lo and behold, at one particular time, they woke up and they found all those tomatoes were completely destroyed. And then they came back to the local community and they asked the community to say, what happened? And the local community responded and said, the hippos came out of the rivers and destroyed all the tomatoes you had planted. And these Italians were so angry, and they asked the Africans to say, why didn't you tell us? And they responded and said, you never inquired and you never involved us and you never asked us to support you. So same thing applies. We cannot shift the power, reimagine African philanthropy without engaging the local communities themselves. You know, there's an amazing project that is currently running, you know, which is called Giving for Change. You know, and Giving for Change seeks to empower local communities to drive their own development. And I feel that's very important in our quest to shift the power and to also change the African philanthropy narrative. The other thing that I want to talk about is that as African philanthropists, I feel like it's very important, and we have to take note that we cannot tell our own stories in the absence of data. We need to invest wholly in research. And I think that's something that Adwoa also talked about. You know, Epic Africa, I think that was about somewhere June this year, if I'm not mistaken. They did an amazing research on the impact of COVID-19 on African civil society organizations and what's the way forward. And I would advise maybe, you know, Adwoa could share that amazing report, that amazing survey and report that was done. And when I read that report, I came to understand that this is what we need if we have to reimagine African philanthropy, if we have to rewrite the narrative of African philanthropy. The availability of data will make people understand that Africans give and they give a lot. When we talk about high net worth givers and individual givers, you know, during the period of COVID-19, we have seen how Africans have organized themselves to champion their own development and to drive their own change. African organizations and African parastatal organizations, they have come together during this period of COVID-19 to see what can actually be done in order to, in order to rethink the kind of environment we want to see in post-COVID-19. In my own country, Zambia, you know, we had so many local companies contributing to our fight against COVID-19. But that in itself is not information that many people in the global south will understand, will have a knowledge of. That information in itself is not information that many countries in the in the Asian region will also have knowledge of, if we do not organize ourselves to ensure that we have data and well-researched information that supports what we're doing at the local level. And I think it's also important to understand this, we need to invest wholly in time and resources and in strengthening local capacities as well as local capabilities. We cannot exist in a vacuum. And I feel, you know, this is something that, you know, Chantal also talked about, the need to collaborate, the need to build trust and social cohesion. If, you know, we cannot work in silos and expect to rewrite African philanthropy. We cannot work in silos and expect that we're going to achieve our desire of shifting the power. No. We need to work, you know, we need to appreciate the importance of unity. We need to appreciate the importance of coexistence within the African philanthropic sector. The other aspect we also have to understand is that, you know, in our quest to, you know, to drive programs that seek to curb poverty, you know, achieve sustainable healthcare, you know, reduce inequalities, African philanthropy also has a serious role to play in championing matters of climate change. African philanthropy also has a serious role to play in championing matters of human rights. African philanthropy also has a serious role to play in championing of matters of peace, justice, and strengthening of institutions. African philanthropy has a serious role to play in driving the attainment of our Agenda 2063. African philanthropy also has a serious role to play in championing the successful development of all our sustainable development goals, because we only have 9 years to reach our target as a global village. So as African philanthropists, we should not only look at ourselves as, you know, giving, you know, in order for us to ensure that people that haven't eaten have eaten, you know, giving in order for us to ensure that people that don't have clothes. But we need to reach a point where when we give, we drive sustainable development to a point where humanity in itself reaches the point of believing in who they are and in their own capabilities, because we have what it takes to curb matters of climate change as the African philanthropy community. We have what it takes to achieve quality education. We have what it takes to attain peace, justice, and strong institutions as the African philanthropy sector. On the other hand, the other aspect I also want to highlight on is the need for us to note that it's the local leaders and the local philanthropists that understand the challenges of their communities. Funders can only assume. So to the funders that are listening to us as we speak right now, it's very important that you engage the local community, the local leaders, and the local philanthropic organization, because they are the ones who understand what is happening on the local, at the local level. You can't, we cannot go to Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, and assume that we understand the challenges they're going through. You can't come to Zambia and assume that we understand the challenges that people are going through. On the other hand, as African philanthropists operating at the local level, we also have to understand what it is we're trying to advance. Do you do what you say you will do? Do you achieve what you said you will achieve at the time you said you will achieve it? Do you allocate resources to what you said you're going to allocate resources to? Do you ensure that you are accountable in championing the development you want to see in your local community? Because it's one thing to shift the power, but it's yet another thing to ensure that we as African philanthropist organizations are also trustworthy and we are championing social cohesion. In my conclusion, for the future sustenance of African philanthropy, we need to reach a point where the private sector, the public sector, and the philanthropic sector work hand in hand. As I said when I first started my conversation, is that we can't work in silos. We need to work together in order to champion the Africa that we all want to see for ourselves. Philanthropy should not support civil organizations for who they are not, but should champion them for who they are. As funders come to Africa to support philanthropic-driven organizations, they should not support organizations for who they want them to be, but for who they are and what they are championing, ensuring that they champion the development they want to see and not the development that other actors want to see. So with this said, I want to say thank you very much for having me. And I hope I've shared one or two things. I know I talk too much, but with these few pointers, I hope somebody has picked up one or two. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Mwila. Oh, so much amazing practical knowledge, insights, and wisdom that you've shared with us about African philanthropy. You have provoked us to think differently about African philanthropy, and there is a thread that's going through all the three discussions that have been going on, and that is data. And there is a very famous saying that goes, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. Until we as Africans learn to tell our stories about not just philanthropy in general, but African philanthropy, we will always look like the continent that is waiting for foreign aid. And we forget to tell our stories. And we can only tell our stories when we have data, because data will help us to sing our song with our tunes and with the words that we know. And I mean, it's amazing to listen to all this, to be part of this, to learn. For each and every one of us who's here, I would like you to go to the chat and say thank you to each and every one of our panelists. Share with us, what have you learned today? This is a highly participatory panel, and I would like you to share with us, what have you learned from each and every one of our panelists? Right now, I would like us to go into about 20 minutes of Q&A session. And the way this will run is we will have questions that have been shared in our Q&A section, and I will share it with our panelists, and whichever panelists can respond to it. So our audience, I'm going to urge you to go to the Q&A questions. If there's any thought that has come, if there's anything that you're thinking of, okay, how about this and how about that? We want you to go there, share your questions. So far, we have about 3 questions, and I will go straight to them and ask. So we'll start with a question from Rupin Aganze. Rupin Aganze is asking, when we create a parallelism between philanthropy and fundraising, what a fresh, I think Rupin means, what fresh funding ideas are we going to attract, or what fresh, what fundraising ideas to attract donors? I think what Rupin is asking here is, what are the fresh fundraising ideas that we need to put or to discuss when we have philanthropy and fundraising together? And here we're not just talking about any philanthropy, we're talking about African philanthropy and the opportunities that lie there. So whichever one of our panelists, are there any ideas, especially from the experiences that you have with philanthropy, the African way, and what data is telling us? Are there any fresh ideas that an African organization can use to attract new donors to fund them?
Thank you, Caroline. If I may start, I think that's such a great question. And you know, one thing that I was thinking about in sort of like answering that question, I go back to what Mwila and Adwoa said about the data. Yes, we do need a lot more data to really understand what's driving more African philanthropists beyond just high net worth individuals, right? We know they're individual givers on the continent, but what is driving them and what are they interested in? But from my perspective, I think what has been, and what I love about the evolution of African philanthropy is really to start looking at, there's these innovative financing approaches that we have, whether it's impact investing, resource-based financing, that are attractive. And I think we tend to look at only global donors or global funders, but no, this is very attractive to African philanthropists and African individuals. We have a growing middle income class across the continent. These are new approaches that we're looking at. I can even point to one example that I'm so proud of in Save the Children in Rwanda, that is looking at cryptocurrency and looking at how do we bring in other funders that we would not think of, non-traditional funders, to support the work and impacting more change. And so we increasingly see more opportunities through impact investing, I should say, that I think it's another model, or another channel, I should say, that would also attract more funders from Africa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, Adwoa.
Sure. If I could just add to that, I didn't really have an opportunity to really talk in depth about the work of Epic Africa. And I think that what Chantal has just said about, you know, starting first with actually the data. I think sometimes when we think about fundraising, part of the tension is that our communities within the continent oftentimes think that African non-for-profits are being led astray or are being driven by an outside agenda. And we need to actually be more mindful of what is going on within our domestic context. And I'm going to give you an example of how African non-for-profits actually are doing that. I just want to use this as an opportunity just to talk about Epic Africa for like 1 second to respond to this question. My business partner and I really started Epic Africa to solve a problem around data that we saw was missing within the sector, but also to have a real sort of conversation and an exploration to what is the disconnect between funders and between African donors. We saw that donors were also saying, we can't find these these great non-for-profits to fund. And we saw that non-for-profits were looking for resources. When we started on this journey, we are supposed to be having an honest conversation here also about trust within this sector, which I think there is a dearth of. When we started this journey, many of our comrades, our colleagues told us we were crazy to try to encourage non-for-profits to share personal information about the inner workings of their organizations. Why would non-for-profits do that? It seems almost sort of counterintuitive. But for us, we said that this is a demonstration of accountability, of transparency. And if non-for-profits want to attract resources from more local donors, from more international donors, there needs to be an understanding to show what is going on within the organizations. But we really had to find a way to make it not punitive so that non-for-profits would be encouraged to share their data. One of the things in this sector that we also have to acknowledge is when we are chasing resources, we are often playing a game to write proposals, to fit ourselves into boxes, to be able to attract resources. Epic Africa was able to attract this data by saying, non-for-profits, come to our platform. We're having a competition, not about what you're doing in your program, but tell us about your operations. What is not sexy in this sector is to talk about operations. What does your board look like? What do your finances look like? But those are the mechanisms that are going to make sure that you as an institution are there tomorrow. That is what a funder, at the end of the day, even though they don't fund oftentimes operations, is going to need to make an informed decision about your organization. So we got non-for-profits in 2018, 2019 to share this data. And what is so shocking to see is that what non-for-profits shared then, at the time when the pandemic came, is what they were sharing again. They were saying to non-for-profits, to funders in the sector, we need you as funders to be responsive to us. We need you to not be funding in these short-term intervals. We need you to also demonstrate patient capital. We need you to also trust us to be able to make informed decisions about our own agency on this continent. And we need you to reimagine capacity building. Many of these things at the time of COVID are what African non-for-profits were crying for. And as Chantal said, the funding community responded to it. I think, first of all, a lot of what we need to do is to spend time figuring out what it is our local context and funders are looking to fund. I think we need to get creative about approaching funders that we would never suspect or think would maybe fund what we are doing and introduce them to our work and use that as a way to get buy-in. I just want to finish by just reading this quote by the late, great Kofi Annan, who said several years ago, data gaps undermine our ability to target resources, develop policies, and track accountability. Without good data, we're flying blind. If you can't see it, you can't solve it. And I'm so excited that after so many years of talking about these issues, we're really now coming to the heart of what it is that we need around our own agenda setting. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will go to the next question. So much insights that have been shared there about data. And I believe there are other questions around data that I think have been responded to. There is another angle that we will take here, and we'll talk about, this is a question from Vania Kibui. How do we leverage African philanthropy for government accountability? Oh, such big words. Such that it's not only about fundraising for organizations and startup in the continent, but also building sustainable accountability movements and frameworks in Africa for African organizations. I just added that for Africa and African organizations. So one of you here could help us respond to this question. How do we leverage African philanthropy for government accountability?
That's a big question, eh?
It is.
That's a huge question, but maybe I can try to maybe give a few highlighters, and maybe my colleagues can come in. How do we leverage African philanthropy for government accountability? I think before, when we talk about, leveraging, African philanthropy for government accountability, I think for me it's a two-way, fate. That's why in the conclusive remarks that I said, I talked about the need for collaboration between the public sector and the philanthropic sector. And I think for me, that's the key element in that particular question, because when we talk about, leveraging African philanthropy for government accountability, I think it's also important for, African philanthropy to also be accountable in order for it to be leveraged for government, accountability, just like what Adwoa said, it's very important that we tap, into not only what funders are looking for, what the private sector is looking for, but also the need for us to ensure that, what is government really looking for? How do we collaborate, with government in one way or the other? And how do we champion laws and policies that support, an enabling environment for African philanthropy to thrive? So that in itself, I think for me, what's really important is building a relationship between the public sector, the philanthropic sector, in order for us to leverage African philanthropy for, for public sector accountability. I think that's what I would really say about that. I don't know what my colleagues think. It's a broad question.
If I may chime in, there is a response. I believe it was Adwoa who spoke about patience, trust, and capacity building. There is a need for, first and foremost, to build those virtues and relationship, building on our social and relational capital that we have. First and foremost, to say, let's trust one another. Before we do anything, do we trust the government? Does the government trust us as philanthropists? Also, do international donors trust us that the money that they will give us, or the resources that they will give to our projects, that will be used correctly? And for me, one of the things here at the NGO Whisper, of course, we work with nonprofits and we build capacity for nonprofits. And in fact, during COVID, we launched the COVID-19 pandemic, we launched our first ever NGO Whisperer Global Fellowship Program. It was like a birthday present that I gave to the nonprofit sector, where I was looking for nonprofits that are nowhere close to achieving so much success by, responding to calls for proposals and all that. And what we are doing is we are building the capacity of these really small and micro nonprofits and positioning them to a place where they can go and compete with other nonprofits for funding and opportunities, or even attract philanthropists because of the systems that they have in place, policies and processes which are lacking among many nonprofits that are actually doing great work in the community, but operating informally. And government has a role to play in that because nonprofits are accountable to governments. When you speak about compliance, how are those units in government coordinating and managing nonprofits? In Kenya, you have the NGO Bureau, in South Africa, you have the Department for Social Development, and so on and so forth. So all these bodies that are governing nonprofits, are they doing their work as they should to ensure that each and every nonprofit that is, whatever they are calling them, some call them in each country, nonprofits, charities, NGOs, and so on and so forth. Do we have a standard that we have set as governments, in countries where these nonprofits are operating to make sure that they are compliant? That's the first thing, when it comes to that. Then once the government has played their role, of course, the nonprofit themselves have a responsibility to do that and to ensure that they comply. Then there are systems of checks, and balances to see how do these nonprofits, especially the smaller ones that are making a great impact in their communities, because we're talking about grassroots organizations that are impacting their lives of people in their communities, and there are people who give. Sometimes it's just in-kind donation, their time, they're volunteering to it. How do we compensate those people? What system and processes are there for government to compensate people who are volunteering for nonprofits? Do we have it? I mean, I live in the UK right now, but I'm Kenyan. I've lived in South Africa, and I know it does not exist in the countries where I come from, Kenya and South Africa. It does not exist. But if you look here in Europe, when you volunteer, you can write that as, when you're doing your tax filing, and you get a tax relief because you're volunteering your time. And so people are motivated to volunteer. You might not get, monetary remuneration, but you can bill it on your tax and say, I gave 50 hours of my time every month to do this and this and this for 3 months, and this is how much it costs me per hour billing or rate or based on my salary. And so the government gives you a tax relief. That's something we need to push for in the agendas in our own countries, because why? It is possible, it is doable. Now, we are just about to end, and there is another question. Oh, wait. Someone has something to say.
Yeah,
Chantal?
just real quickly from an international organization perspective, and I think both of you touch on the trust aspect of it. I think that's very important. And governments do have a role to play. And I think that, for the longest, we do not recognize whether it's the local level, at the global level, the contributions that African philanthropists are doing. So for me, it's really starting to raise the visibility of the work that they're doing. And second, I go back to my earlier point about collaboration, especially through multi-stakeholder partnerships, where you have partners that can include governments and include African funders. And I think that's a way you can sort of also raise that accountability when you work together in collaboration, just to kind of add that aspect to brilliant intervention.
Yes, can I just piggyback off what Chantal just said and just give an example of an actual African institution, which is seen as a beacon of light, a shining example, the Kenyan Community Development Foundation. It is, I see in the chat, somebody made a great comment. I said, I like that, trust as a commodity. And I think the Kenya Community Development Foundation has stood the test of time to be able to generate trust, to build that capital from governments, from the foreign donors, from domestic donors, from individual donors, so that now when there is something, a conversation about the development agenda in Kenya, they are at the table. They are not the people on the outside trying to bang in and get into the room. They are invited by government, they're invited by the international community. And I think that we also need to be lenient on ourselves in this conversation to really understand that this takes time. Trust takes time, and we as a continent are doing really, really well on this journey to grow our ecosystem and to strengthen it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go into another question. Oh, this is just a comment. Let me see. This is a beautiful one because it's about telling our stories. So from Toby Weaver, and Toby is asking, going forward, how do we best communicate the African philanthropy achievements? I know we've spoken about data, but now this is transferring data into a story, and how best do we tell these stories?
I think maybe I can go first on that one. I think for me, like I always say, is how do we best tell our stories? Every platform that we get, let us try by all means to market the African philanthropy story. You know, on this platform, you never know who's listening. So we need to show the world out there that as African philanthropists, we can be organized. As African philanthropists, we can be trusted. As African philanthropists, we can build social cohesion. As African philanthropists, we can drive development. As African philanthropists, we can coexist. As African philanthropists, we have what it takes, you know, to drive our own agenda. So I feel, how do we communicate our story is through every platform that we can have, every opportunity that comes our way. You know, for my colleagues at Save the Children, let us do what we can. You know, for my colleagues at Epic Africa, let us do what we can. For Oxford HR, let us all do what we can in order to communicate the African philanthropy story, because we can't wait for anybody else, you know, to communicate the story for us. You know, I get to be given so many platforms to speak about issues of, reclaiming the identity of African philanthropy, matters of governance and leadership. And I always ensure that when I'm done speaking, the perception that people had about African philanthropy is completely baptized. So I think that's very important, that all of us, when we have an opportunity to communicate the story, we do it to the best of our capabilities. And I would like to hear from my colleagues on what they think about this as well. Thanks.
I just to add to that, first of all, shout out to you, Mwila, and the African Philanthropy Network. I honestly feel like I'm on that website every other day, just looking at the research and the reports and the different surveys that you do for us to really understand African philanthropy. And I think for me, the best way is actually to invest in more research about what African philanthropy is doing on the continent. It shouldn't be that there's I think only 2 schools of studying philanthropy. I think one is in Egypt and another one in South Africa. It should be in each country. We don't know, I haven't received and I don't know a lot more research about Islamic funding in Senegal. I think that the way we tell our story is actually investing in those sort of places and centers on the African continent that can be able to sort of share the knowledge and share lessons learned from other African philanthropies and what's working in the African context.
I would stand and agree with the comments that my esteemed panelists have made, and would just throw in another dimension. I would ask the first question as to, in response to this question, who is the audience? Who are you trying to communicate to? Because I think that when we're having this conversation also, we've got to tailor and be on target with the message. When we're having a family conversation within our space, when I'm in your kitchen, it'll be a bit different from the conversation I'm having out there if I'm trying to get resources. So I think that we've got to really hone our message. We've got to be sophisticated. And I want to throw in this message. Sometimes when we're talking about these very, very nuanced, complicated, big words, big English words, we've got to actually also think about if this is vertical, horizontal, sideways, the other way. We've got to message to all types of people. And I remember one of my colleagues just talking about this. He always takes it back. How do I explain what I do as a PhD working in this field to my grandmother in the village who is as brilliant as anything, but needs to understand it within a context. And I think these are some of the ways in which we've got to start thinking about messaging and communication in more sophisticated ways.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor and a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. Put your hands together to our esteemed panelists. All the questions have been addressed, or the questions around data. There were so many of them, well answered. And I'd like to give a summary of what has been discussed today in just 1 minute. I would like to thank Adwoa for introducing us into this panel and by sharing insights. And what came out of all that you spoke about was data, and how data is so powerful in telling who and what African philanthropy looks like, and just looking at the opportunities, the vertical, the horizontal, and the technological issues around it, and how we can utilize data to move forward with African philanthropy in a way in which, again, tying it back to what Mwila said, who just came as the third panelist, the stories that we are telling. So all these things we've talked about brings us back to who are we as Africans, philanthropists? Who are we as people who are standing in the gap to say we are supporting it? We are the philanthropists. We are the receivers of our own philanthropic activities, and we are the ones telling these stories. And then to tie it to good, our best practices that have been shared by Save the Children, looking at power dynamics, capacity, resource allocation, and also looking at how local actors are empowered to really position themselves, not just to receive, but to be philanthropists themselves, because African philanthropists have always been there, will always be there. I go back to the saying that I shared: until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. We all have a role to play in this until we learn to tell our stories. And it's not just about telling our stories to anybody and everybody, to be very strategic on what stories, as Adwoa mentioned, we are sharing where. There are some stories we need to share within the room in our kitchens, and there are stories that we need to share outside. What stories are we sharing? What vocabulary are we using? Because our African languages are so rich that when I want to say the word love in English, there's only one, but in our languages, you can go up to 10 ways of saying love. When I say I would love a cup of tea, it's very different from when I say I love you, my good friend, or my husband, or my children. Very different. How can we use those words to tell our stories so that our people understand? When it comes to systems and processes, how do we do that? Things that are not well explained in our vocabulary when you talk about system, processes, and mechanism. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say a big thank you for joining us today on this amazing, amazing panel on African philanthropy, opportunities and challenges. In Oxford HR, we would like to have part 2 of this, because as you have seen, there's a lot still yet to be discussed. Thank you so much, Oxford HR, for bringing us this Oxford HR Knowledge Festival. We are grateful and we are honored to be here. From all of us, thank you, bye, and God bless.